Thank you for joining us as we run through our beginner's guide to the Register of Persons Holding a Controlled Interest in Land, or RCI for short. In this presentation, we will introduce you to the RCI. We will take you through the background and purpose of the RCI legislation, which was developed by Scottish Government and approved in Parliament. We will introduce you to the service itself, as well as explain the role of ROS. We also want to introduce you to the language of RCI and provide some information on how to decide if you are in scope of it. We'll then look at the categories affected by RCI. After that, we'll take a high-level look at what information you need to provide, the duties associated with RCI, how RCI is an event-driven register, and then we'll finally look at our guidance articles. I should point out that we have extensive guidance on everything we cover in this presentation and more on our knowledge base, and we will share links to this throughout. By the end of the presentation, we will have covered the following key stages. Do I need to register? What do I need to make an entry? What do I need to prepare? How do I make an entry? What do I do after submitting? We'll understand the 30-day period before the entry is published and searchable, and we'll talk about maintenance and updates. I'll go into more detail on each one of these. Now we'll take a look at the background and purpose of RCI. We'll first look at who we, Registers of Scotland, are, what the timelines of RCI are, and then we'll move on to more detail about RCI itself. At Registers of Scotland, we hold and maintain 21 public registers, including the Land Register, General Register of Sazines, and the Books of Council and Session. We are a non-ministerial office of the Scottish Government, and the Keeper of the Registers of Scotland is directly accountable to the Scottish Parliament. At ROS, we design and build digital services to enable our customers and the public to access the registers we hold. If you're familiar with us and our work, you'll be aware of some of our key services here, including ScotList and the Digital Submission Service. All are designed to make interacting with ROS easier for our customers. To set some context, let's take a look at the timelines of RCI and how it came about. The Land Reform Scotland Act 2016 gave regulation-making power to Scottish ministers to provide for the disclosure and publication of information about controlling interest in landowners and tenants across Scotland. To progress this, in 2016, the Scottish Government ran a public consultation on controlling interests in land and improving transparency in land ownership in Scotland. In 2018, draft regulations were laid and the Scottish Government consulted on these. Parliament unanimously passed these regulations in February 2021. The role of ROS is to design, build and maintain the register in accordance with this legislation. Having an in-house development and operations team gives us the ability to take feedback and make fast improvements to both the submission service and the guidance. The register commenced on the 1st of April 2022, originally with a one-year transitional period ending on 1st of April 2023. Scottish Parliament have since approved an extension to the time period for compliance for RCI submissions by a period of 12 months. Offence provisions will now take effect after the 1st of April 2024. Scottish ministers do encourage everyone who is eligible to engage with the process as early as possible, though, and give themselves plenty of time to register before the new deadline. So what is RCI about? Firstly, it is important to note that RCI is not a register of land. It is, as the name suggests, a register of persons. This register will make it easier for anyone, whether that's an individual, community body or other party, to find out who has control of the decision-making process in relation to land and property in cases where it is not publicly transparent elsewhere. The regulations are intended to ensure there can no longer be categories of owner or tenant where, intentionally or otherwise, control of decision-making is obscured. This means that it will be possible to look behind every category of entity in Scotland to see who controls land, and I'll talk about these classifications shortly. The regulations place responsibility on owners and tenants to supply information to RCI of their controlling interest. After the grace period for registration ends, penalties will become applicable for failure to register. It is free to submit to and search the register. It's important to understand the language used within RCI. This will better help you frame and understand your own situation. It may also help you decide if you're in scope. Let me start by saying that when I refer to tenant throughout this webinar, I specifically mean a tenant with a registered or recorded lease of more than 20 years. In RCI, we have two parties, the recorded person and the associate. The recorded person is the owner or tenant of land in Scotland. Then we have the associate. This is the person who has significant influence or a controlling interest in the land owned or tenanted by the recorded person. For clarity, in RCI, the definition of land can include buildings and other structures too. I'll explain what we mean by both of these roles in more detail and what duties they attract towards the end of the webinar. We're now going to take a look at where we might find recorded persons, which can be dependent on how the land is held, and then where associates may exist and therefore create a need for a submission. As such, we're going to turn our attention to the 5 categories of recorded persons affected by RCI. To begin, we will look at the capacity in which the recorded person holds the property. That is the classification in which they fall. The classifications include individuals, partnerships, trusts, unincorporated bodies, and overseas entities. We'll go over each of these in more detail in the next few slides, and there are links to each relevant knowledge base page also. Let's take a look at individuals. An individual who might require to submit to RCI is a person who has a contractual or other arrangement with a person who would be considered an associate. By this, the regulations mean someone other than the individual has significant influence or control over the land, or the individual actually owns or tenants the lands for or on behalf of the associate under a contractual or other arrangement. If that contract or arrangement is one which relates to a trust, partnership, unincorporated body, or overseas entities, then they fall into one of the other categories, which I'll go on to speak about. In summary, an individual can be a living person, but not an organisation, and nor are they considered an individual if they have an official role, such as a trustee. Next, we have partnerships. The term partnership covers the situation where 2 or more persons agree to conduct business on the basis of dividing the profits and sharing the losses between them. Just to be clear here, the word person in this case includes every person recognised as a person in law. So a partnership could be formed between a natural person and a non-natural person, such as a company or partnership. Associations formed for purposes other than profits, for example, clubs, cannot be partnerships, and we'll talk more about these later. It is important to note when making a submission as a person to RCI as a partner in a partnership, you should clearly specify this. Let's take a look at our 3rd classification, trusts. Land in Scotland may be placed in a trust to deliver benefits to family members and ultimately to be inherited by a later generation, or on behalf of investors to support a commercial venture, or to deliver charitable benefits to a specific group or to the population at large. Trusts generally consist of a truster, the person who sets up the trust over land or property, the trustee or trustees, those who become legal owners of the assets within the trust as named in the trust deed, and the beneficiaries, those who will receive certain benefits as set out in the trust deed. An unincorporated body is an organisation set up through an agreement between a group of people who come together for a reason other than to make a profit. Unincorporated bodies or associations do not have legal personality, and therefore they cannot own land in their own right. As such, the ownership of assets lies with individuals acting on its behalf, usually office bearers or management committees. The trustees will be shown on the land register or Sazines register as the owners or tenants of the land. An unincorporated body is typically a small body that might be a charity or another voluntary or community group. Common examples include village hall associations, sports clubs, voluntary groups, and faith and belief groups. Finally, there are overseas entities. These are entities whose main place of business is outside of the United Kingdom. For RCI, this can be a body corporate, partnership, or an unincorporated body that is a legal person, i.e. a non-natural person, governed by the law of a country or territory outside the UK. All of these categories have multiple examples online, and we'll run over a few scenarios shortly. Let's start by talking about whether your circumstances mean there is or isn't a need to register. It might be that there's no need, and we'll start by looking at that now. When making a decision, it might be more useful to first rule out the obvious reasons why you might be out of scope of RCI. Owners or tenants will automatically be out of scope of RCI if already subject to another UK transparency regime listed in the regulations. Transparency regimes enable the public to have greater access to information relating to various entities. They act as the legislative tool used to help ensure the information is secure, reliable, and accessible to the public. Whilst not limited to, they can help unveil governance structures and identify those who can make decisions within those entities. Based on this, you will automatically be out of scope of RCI if you are already subject to another listed UK transparency regime, as the relevant information is already in the public domain. There is a full and comprehensive list of transparency regimes in Schedule 2 of the RCI regulations, and there are a number of examples on screen. But to pull out three of the more obvious examples, you'll be out of scope if you're a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation or a UK equivalent, if you already report into the Register of People with Significant Control regime, which is held by Companies House, and this typically includes UK companies, LLPs, Scottish limited partnerships, etc., or if you're a public body. To find out more about how transparency regimes work in connection with RCI, please visit our knowledge base articles. You'll find these on our website, and the link to the relevant page is on screen. There are some complexities around the legislation, and this webinar will share some insight into these at a relatively basic level. As ever, we recommend that you familiarise yourself with the regulations, read our guidance and other sources of information, which I'll reference later on for fuller explanations. If you decide that you do not fall into one of the listed transparency regimes and are not exempt, it's important to consider the following when deciding if you would need to register. Broadly speaking, if persons are specifically the named owner or tenant on the title, and if there is a person or persons who are not named on the title but do have a controlling interest over the land, then it is likely you will need to make a submission. In the situation highlighted above, the owner or tenant is the recorded person, and the persons who have controlling interests are the associates. I will go into further detail as to what the regulations define as controlling interest in a further slide. There is also an additional impacted area to consider. It may actually be the case that existing owners or tenants are no longer associated with the land. There will be instances where the land is held by trustees and where, due to the passage of time, the land register or register of Sazeens lists persons who no longer have any connection with the property as owners or tenants. The most likely example of this situation is where the trustees have resigned or are deceased. For example, you may have a property that was purchased back in 1918, but all of the original trustees who were named on the title are now deceased. In this instance, the current trustees, or those holding on behalf of an unincorporated body, are to be treated as the owners or tenants. In these circumstances, the current trustees or office bearers would need to register in RCI and be registered as both a recorded person and associate. It is important to note that this will only be applicable where all trustees or office bearers no longer have any connection with the land. This may be unfamiliar, so please head to our guidance where it is outlined further in Regulation 23A of the RCI regulations, and there is also a video in our knowledge base. So I said I would go into more detail on this. What is meant by controlling interest? People with a controlling interest in land can influence the decisions made about the land, such as in relation to the disposal, leasing, or changing the use of land. The purpose of separating the information about a piece of land between who owns it and who has a significant influence in what happens to it is that the owner or tenant may not be the only one that makes these decisions. For example, it may be owned by an organisation like a church, sports club, or community group. The organisation owns the land on behalf of their stakeholders, or in the case of a church, people within the church structure. For example, the owner of a property, in RCI referred to as the recorded person, wishes to sell or lease the land. There may be others who can influence these high-level decisions and direct the activities of the owner, even though they do not own the land, and the owner would be required to take their influence into account. As mentioned, in RCI, the person who has significant influence or control over decisions is known as an associate. Just to flag here that for unincorporated bodies specifically, rather than controlling interests, it is general control and management, and these tend to be office bearers. To give you some examples for each category, firstly, individuals. You own farmland that you inherited from your uncle, and you are named on the title, but you don't live nearby. You have an arrangement with your father that he can use that area as part of the farm he has next door. You're not involved with the land, and you take instructions from your father in respect of any dealings with the land. Therefore, you are the recorded person, and your father is the associate. For a partnerships example, if you own a business which has 3 partners listed on the land register, and you have appointed a fourth, the fourth person would need to be registered as an associate by all the other partners, as they have equal controlling interests in the land as the original 3. In a trust, a beneficiary may stand to benefit from a trust put in place by previous generations on their behalf, but this does not necessarily mean they have controlling interest if they do not influence high-level decisions such as purchasing additional land. This is because a purely financial interest does not equate to engagement in the governance of a landowning body or entity. Then we have unincorporated bodies. If you volunteer to arrange the flowers at your local church, but could not influence high-level decisions such as selling part of the land, you are unlikely to be an associate. To provide a second example here, if you're a member of a golf club, you may have a right to vote on significant decisions such as selling off an area of land, but this does not amount to general control of the management of the club, and therefore you would not be an associate. This is because the regulations state that a person is responsible for the general control and management of the administration of a body if they hold an office or a position such as chair, secretary, or treasurer. Finally, for overseas entities, an example of controlling interest would be where land is owned by overseas company, a director, or other individual who has more than 25% of the voting rights would be an associate. In some structures, it may be that the overseas company is owned by a UK company, in which case it may be an associate. It's worth noting that while a company registered in the UK cannot be a recorded person because they already report into another transparency regime, they can be an associate. Diagrams setting out examples of how the RCI regulations apply to overseas entities can be found in the Scottish Government's explanatory document. These are really just examples, and I'd once again direct you to our guidance for detailed examples and to consider your own circumstances and setups. I want to talk a little bit more about Regulation 23A. During the development of the register, a gap was identified in the principal RCI regulations, initially in relation to trusts. When a person noted as the owner in either the land register or the SASIM registers is either deceased or has resigned as a trustee, they no longer have an interest in the trust. It was identified that under these circumstances, there was no one on whom the obligations of a recorded person would fall, for example, the listing of associates. This could also apply where ex officio officer bearers are not listed and only their office is named. It is mainly trusts and unincorporated bodies who are affected by this. To address this issue, a Scottish statutory instrument was laid in Parliament on 22nd December 2021, amending the principal regulations by making provision for these cases. To be clear, the 2 scenarios that would trigger Regulation 23A are where all the original trustees or office bearers have ceased to be involved, or only the office is listed. As I said previously, RCI needs to list currently involved trustees or office bearers to meet requirements. Each of these persons would need to list themselves as recorded persons, themselves again as an associate, and then list any other associates. We recently ran a full webinar on this topic, and as I mentioned, there is guidance and a video online. Now I'm going to talk through some example scenarios. For our first scenario, we have the Village Hall Association. It is an unincorporated body. Taylor, Idris, and Ryan are all trustees of the association. They are also named owners on the land register. In addition, there is also a committee of 3 office bearers, which includes the chair, treasurer and secretary. They are responsible for the general control and management of the association. However, they're not named on the land register. Have a think about whether or not they would be in scope for RCI. The answer here is yes, they are in scope. In this instance, Taylor, Idris and Ryan would all be recorded persons, and each of them must register each of the office bearers as their associates, as they are not named on the title but have general control and management roles. Our second scenario is the Dunston Partnership. The Blue Company UK Limited, Yellow Company UK Limited and Green Company UK Limited are partners of the Dunston Partnership. All 3 partners are named owners in the title sheet. Blue Company, Yellow Company and Green Company are subject to the Persons with Significant Control Register. This is a transparency regime. Again, have a think about whether they are in scope. No. Even though Blue Company, Yellow Company and Green Company are acting in their capacity as partners of the Dunston Partnership, they are not required to register as recorded persons in RCI. This is because they are already subject to a transparency regime outlined in Schedule 2 of the RCI regulations. This is the final example. Anne and John are named as owners of the land held by the trust on the land register. Neither Anne or John have any involvement with the trust anymore. The land register title was not updated when they left. Phil and Nicola are the current trustees. For this example, have a think about whether or not Regulation 23A is triggered here. The answer is yes. Under Regulation 23A of the RCI regulations, Phil and Nicola are treated as the owners here. For RCI, Phil and Nicola will need to separately register as recorded persons. Because they're not on the land register title, they're also associates. Both Phil and Nicola will each need to register themselves and one another as an associate. So to be completely clear, when Nicola registers as a recorded person, she will add first herself and then Phil as an associate. When Phil registers as a recorded person, he will first add himself and then add Nicola as an associate. It must be made clear that they are submitting on that basis by answering yes to the question, have all trustees in the title ceased to be trustees when filling out the online application. There are further examples in our guidance articles on both trusts and unincorporated bodies. There are also some excellent examples in the Scottish Property Professional Support Lawyers Group article published in the April 2022 edition of the Law Society Journal. These include examples on SIP purchases and overseas trusts. As I've mentioned a couple of times, we have extensive guidance in our knowledge base on our website, which I'll talk about now before discussing the other online support on offer. We know there is a lot to take in around the regulations of the RCI, and we've written some key guidance. We've recently restructured our RCI guidance articles to make them clearer to navigate and view at a glance, and we've introduced a help and support section. These pages will help you in understanding RCI, whether you're in scope and the subsequent considerations if you are. We strongly recommend you read these as they will support you in creating and managing entries. We've split our knowledge base into different sections, and we'd recommend to everyone to start by reading the articles that sit under Do I Need to Register? These give you a more in-depth understanding of what we've covered today and provide a lot more information and links to the specifics for your scenario. Under each article, we've also included the average reading time to help you gauge whether it's one you might need a little more time with. None of them are particularly long, but we appreciate we're all busy people and we felt it was good to know upfront how much time you may need. There are a couple of other things I'd like to pull out from the knowledge base today that I think would be useful. We now have 4 demo videos on how to submit as our trust on our website, including how to set up an account from scratch and what type of account you should use. This, along with our guidance, is a very helpful demonstration to use alongside your first submission, even if you're not submitting as a trust. There is also a video specifically about Regulation 23A. It's the 5th down on the list from the link on the page, entitled If the Existing Owners or Tenants Are No Longer Associated with the Land. You'll also find a recently added video, an introduction to our new copy function, which I'll cover in more detail shortly. The direct link to the videos is on screen along with the knowledge base homepage. Finally, on the RCI dashboard page, you'll find the What's New at the top section, and that is a useful link to new features of the service. We also have our online support tool. This can be used to help you self-determine if you or your client are likely in scope of RCI as a recorded person. This tool can give you an indication as to whether or not you would likely need to make an entry. Whilst using the tool, you'll be prompted to answer a series of questions based on yours or your client's circumstances. Once you've completed the questions, you'll be provided with results to indicate whether you likely need to make an entry and where you will find essential information to support that entry. Please be aware the results are dependent on the accuracy of your answers provided, and the final decision should be made by you. This is only to provide assistance. Based on customer feedback and to help with multiple submissions, we've recently introduced a new copy feature. This allows users to create a new submission by copying details from either a draft or a submitted entry. This will allow you to select parts of the submission that you want to copy into a new one. Recorded person details, land details, ownership details, associate details. When you're copying details, you cannot copy both the recorded person and the land details. This is to prevent duplicate submissions. You can choose to do this from your dashboard, choosing which submission, draft or submitted, you want to copy and picking copy from the drop-down menu. It won't affect the submission that you're copying from. There's guidance online, and the video I've previously mentioned has a walkthrough. Now let's talk about submissions. If you have decided that you're in scope, it's important that certain duties are met and information prepared. For recorded persons, if you are in scope, you must register. You must also verify all the associate's details, provide all the details, and notify the associate that the submission has or will be made. We have created an optional template for this, which can be found on our website. Associates will need to confirm that they are an associate, verify the details when requested by the recorded person, and provide updated details when it's necessary. There are other key duties. An associate must be notified that a submission will be made in their name prior to creating an entry. We have created a template associate verification notice for this purpose online, but it's not compulsory to use this. You can use your own. We'll just take a broad look at the submission steps. First, you have your pre-submission checks, which include the associate verification notice. Then the entry is created with the information gathered by the recorded person. Once created, the recorded person should download the associate notifications and share them with the associates. And then there is maintenance. RCI is an events-driven register, and changes and updates should be made whenever necessary. I'll go into these in more detail. When you come to create your entry, the RCI service breaks the journey down into 4 main sections. This includes providing details on the recorded person, whether they're an individual or an organisation. This includes full name and contact address. The recorded person as an individual is the trustee or office bearers, and you cannot use the name in the body itself. This is because RCI is a register of persons. Then there's land, whether that's on the land register or one of the SASIN's registers. For RCI, we're looking for a clear way to identify the land you're registering. This information can be found using our website ScotList. There is guidance online about finding and describing land. Then there's ownership. This is the capacity in which the recorded person owns or tenants the land. And finally, the associate details, including, if they're an individual, their full name, date of birth, although please note the date of birth will not be published or publicly available. This is purely for internal identification purposes. Also their contact address, which can be the registered office. And the name of the body is optional for associates. The date of the association must also be provided if known. If an associate has previously been added to the register, their associate reference number must also be provided. This is a requirement of RCI. I appreciate I just listed a lot of information. All of this can be found within our knowledge base article on information needed to make an RCI entry. The link is on screen. Once you've verified all the associate details, you'll then move on to create your entry. To access the service and create entries, you'll need an RCI account. There are 2 account types. Firstly, there is our public account. This will allow you to submit yourself as a recorded person and add associates. In addition to our public account, we offer an online services account to our existing business users. If you already have an online services account with us, you can opt in, if you haven't already, to submit to the RCI. Please ask your primary contact to get in touch with customer services if you need to be added. Online service users can submit on behalf of multiple recorded persons. If you're new to ROS and think you need a business account, you can set up a new account using the link here. There are certain checks that we are required to make, so please provide as much information as possible. Our service has been designed, built, and user tested to be easy to use, and each page will ask for the relevant information and give you the opportunity to select the options you need before moving to the next screen. We'd welcome any feedback that you have. On this slide are images of the dashboard demonstrating the easy steps required to complete your entry. After you've created your entry, you must then issue your associate with a notification advising them that the submission has been made, the details that are included, and their rights and duties, and this must be done within 7 days of the date of submission. The service will automatically generate a notification for you, and you can either do this at submission point or access it later from your dashboard by using the Actions menu to select Download Associate Notifications beside the relevant entry, as shown on the slide. You can also choose to create a combined notification if that suits better. This is one of our newer features. Once an entry has been made, it is the duty of the recorded person to maintain the entry. This is done through the Manage an Entry option on the RCI homepage of the service. This could include removing associates, changing any information supplied if it's changed, for example, a change of address, and if the recorded person ceases to be the recorded person, then the entry must be removed. It can also include AGM changes to office bearers or a partner retiring and being replaced, for example. Now I want to mention security declarations. There are circumstances where an individual may require to hide their details from being publicly searchable in the register, and this is why it is essential that persons are notified if they are to be listed as part of an RCI submission. Before the submission goes live, the associate can request to have their details redacted from the public view of the register. This might occur if having details publicly available would put them or an individual connected to them at risk of violence or abuse, the threat of violence or abuse, or intimidation. The right to make a security declaration is intended to ensure that no one is put at serious risk through the inclusion of their information on the register. We have an article on security declarations that provides more in-depth information on how and when a security declaration may be applied for. The link is on screen along with some visuals of the dashboard. Within the article, there are clear steps on how to apply for a security declaration and information on the acceptable forms of evidence that can be supplied to support your application. I would also just like to mention the new UK Register of Overseas Entities and what that means for RCI. You may be aware of the UK Economic Crime, Transparency and Enforcement Act 2022, which attained royal assent in March 2022. This legislation introduced the Register of Overseas Entities, which is operated by Companies House in Cardiff. The aim of the new UK Register of Overseas Entities is to prevent overseas entities from using land and property in any of the UK jurisdictions for money laundering. The benefit of transparency here is secondary. This new register went live on the 1st of August 2022. Overseas entities must register in the new register at Companies House and provide information on who their beneficial owners or managing officers are before they can transact on UK property. Now, registration in that new register of overseas entities will not make an overseas entities be out of scope from requirement to register in RCI. When the Register of Overseas Entities and the RCI were initially in policy development, the view of both the UK and Scottish governments was that double reporting should be avoided where possible. Our current understanding is that this has not changed and that the Scottish Government will consider the extent of duplication in due course. They will then decide whether it is appropriate to amend the RCI regulations. It's important to note that in the meantime, overseas entities that are in scope of RCI must register irrespective of ROE and make arrangements to comply with RCI legislation ahead of the transition period ending and criminal offences coming, pending the potential changes we mentioned earlier into force in April 2024. There is further information online, including a guide outlining the differences between the two registers. The link is on screen. We will now recap on the webinar. Firstly, we ran through the timeline of RCI and then more about the register itself and why it has been introduced. We then introduced you to the language and terminology of RCI, familiarising you with what we mean by recorded person, associate, land and controlling interest, and how to decide if you're in scope. We then focused on the categories and what is meant by controlling interest or general control and management for each. We took a broad look at Regulation 23A. We then looked at typical RCI scenarios to help you decide whether the example of unincorporated body, partnership and trust were in scope. We then looked at online support and touched on some of the duties bestowed upon the recorded person and the associate. Then we took a high-level overview of security declarations and covered ROE. I would encourage you to keep a regular check on our What's New page in the service, as this will inform you of the latest enhancements. You'll find more information on the copy function I mentioned above here, as well as on duplicate associates and combined notifications. We've shared links throughout the presentation, but you'll also find these in the search bar on our website. Finally, here are some key links and contact details. A reminder that you can sign up to live webinars on the ROS events pages. Thank you.